Hello and welcome on the Barricades. My name is Boyan. I will be your host. Today with me is, of course, the co-host of the show, Maria Chernat. Hello, Maria.
Hello, Boyan.
And now to our special guest, Arto Artinian, who's a Bulgarian American academic, maybe even Armenian to some extent, judging by your
Part of my ethnicity is on my father's side, is
right.
Armenian.
The embodiment of internationalism here,
I have no
and
choice.
yeah, right. So he is, as I said, he's an academic. He splits his time between his research that he's conducting in Bulgaria and also teaching in American universities. So we're here to discuss discuss the reactions to the war in Ukraine. The way they manifested themselves in Eastern Europe and the way they manifested themselves in America. We spoke, at great length about that in the previous segment, and now I'd like to have the discussion maybe a bit more. I'd like it to become a bit more theoretical because many notions are applied today to in the discourse, if you like, about the war, which I find to be very strange in a sense that I realize, of course, that we live in a reality where terms and words and sentence or phrases lose their original meaning. But I think that in certain cases, things are going really way too far and become caricature of itself. And one such notion is the notion of imperialism. And unfortunately, now, I don't know how it's perceived in America, whether anyone actually
Mhm.
uses this word or refers to it. But here, in Eastern Europe, particularly the left, and that's very unfortunate, I think, has gone like has basically given up their classical understanding of imperialism and vulgarized it into basically anything that they perceive as aggressive politics, and has thus freed itself to a large extent of the task of defending countries that are actually objects of imperialist violence. And I'm thinking there's something profoundly wrong. I mean, it could be lack of political education. I'm sure it is there. I'm not sure whether it's the most important factor here. There could be, empiricism, vulgar empiricism, just observing something and applying the most applying certain notions in their very primitive with a very primitive understanding of them. But I'd like you, as a person who has this academic background and who has a lot of knowledge and is very knowledgeable about Marxism and Marxist theory, to please present your take about the use or misuse of the term imperialism in the context of Russia Ukraine war.
Sure. Thank you very much. Boyan and Maria, for having me again. I mean, I feel this is the fundamental question
Right.
that we're facing again today, because the word imperialism, some people might think that it kind of fell out of fashion. Maybe that's why it's not talked so much, because imperialism is, in a superficial way, the 19th century, of course, 18th century broadly, or since Columbus, Columbus stumbled upon the southern continent and put in effect, along with the emerging new capitalist class, so that's sort of like, oh yeah, that's old history. The UK is no longer an empire. America is not really an imperialist state because it doesn't really control any colonies directly, except maybe Puerto Rico and some of the small islands in a lot of Hawaiians think, for example. But so it's not there are no imperialist state today. This is sort of like I would say this is kind of like a common understanding within academia as well, if you will. So why bring back this word? And then, of course, in Eastern Europe, the way this word is being activated is by, of course, there are many different histories. We all are the successors, or to many historical narratives, if you will, right? So, of course, in Eastern Europe, I think some activate this word imperialism to reflect their local history, and particularly, I know for a fact, I'm sure it's the same in Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria, when they say, well, Russia traditionally has exerted imperial power in Eastern Europe, or over Eastern Europe. Yes, in its competition with the Ottoman Empire, That's definitely true. But some Bulgarians would say this, public commentators, intellectuals, they would say this is a war against Russian imperialism, neo-Russian imperialism, just the way they did in the Ottoman period. Of course, they conveniently forget that Bulgarians were actually, we were the lucky the lucky byproduct for us was our own sovereignty and the emergence
Yes, the
of a
Romanians
national
too.
state.
And I just want to weigh in
Not
here and
Poland, of
say
course.
that in
Poland has a different.
Romania, they want to change a name of a boulevard that is Kiselev. This is a name of a Russian general. And in 1877, let us remember that the byproduct of the conflict of the Russians and the Ottomans was the independence of two Romanian historical provinces. But they conveniently forget this episode, and they conveniently forget, or I don't know, they exercise some sort of self-imposed ignorance, which is very troubling. I just wanted to weigh that in because in Romania, unlike Bulgaria, the anti-Russian sentiment is just gone through the roof now.
I mean, of course, there are other reasons because as we know, just to be perfectly vulgar, before we go back to imperialism, one of the real immediate goals of a certain faction within the Romanian political military elite or the Polish military elite is, the immediate enlargement potentially of Romanian territories in Moldova or in Western Ukraine and Poland. That's never really far below the surface, right? Bulgarians don't have that ambition because of the historical separateness, but that's a side story. But to talk about imperialism, then something strange happens in history. The Soviet Union emerges as an anti-Russian imperial project, right? But of course, some of the current opponents of Russian policies say, well, the Soviet Union was an imperialist too. Why? And here we enter this kind of meaningless use of the word imperialism. Of course, the Soviet Union had an element of at different parts of its history of Russian chauvinism. Yes. All of the histories and energies and ideas that it inherited from the Russian Empire didn't disappear within the Soviet state, right? They were confronted, they hid, they changed, they shifted. But the first, I think, immediate problem was the Soviet Union an imperialist state? And historians have debates about this, and historians that I really respect, including the Bulgarian Maria Todorova, who teaches. There is a very clear point that the Soviet Union was the premier anti-imperialist political formation of the 20th century. That without the Soviet Union's presence after World War II, most, if not all, of the anti-colonial movements of the world, even though it did not actively support all of them, and in fact, in some of them, it did not participate at all on purpose, the sheer presence of the Soviet Union and its satellite states of Eastern Europe was the premier anti-colonial force of the world, primarily responsible for the destruction of the British Empire globally, or the emergence of all of those independent nation states that are members of the UN today. This is conveniently forgotten. So the Soviet Union is unquestionably anti-colonial in its origin, even to the detriment of greater Russian nationalists, which we hear this even in some of Putin's statements. Although he's now bringing Lenin, he uttered the word Lenin for the first time publicly ever in his public career positively, right? Okay. Now, so why bring up the Soviet Union? Because the Soviet Union is not the Russian Empire. It's a completely different political historical formation, and it exerted overwhelming influence in the development of the last 60 years of global politics in a way that is directly contradictory to the European Union's political self-identity and the United States, of course, political project. Now, why bring this up? Because I think the first thing, the big tragedy of the Russian-Ukrainian war is that this is really the last stage of the implosion of the Soviet Union. I mean, to me, that makes the most sense as the starting point to think about this. This enormous multinational state broke apart, and it broke apart in a completely illegitimate way. Completely illegitimate way. I think Putin made a reference to that finally too, right?
Look, he's made that statement a couple of times, that actually the destruction of the Soviet Union was the most tragic event of the 20th century.
And it was tragic because it was made through the fiat decisions of three local party chiefs. Of course, the decision was so sudden and so traumatic that in not every part, but in most parts of the Soviet Union, it was like a stunning event. It just stunned people. Because people say, how come people didn't reject this and fight to preserve the Soviet Union? They did. 1993 in Moscow, when the Russian democratically elected Russian multi-party parliament was destroyed by tank fire.
Yeah.
And so many people were killed by the Russian liberals led by Yeltsin that to this day, the Russian government does not have public figures officially on how many people died. So there was resistance to the downfall of the Soviet Union, at least in Russia, actively. There was also in Crimea, by the way, in 1991 and 1992. So I think the first point that this is not an imperialist war. Well, to me, it's not an imperialist war on part of Russia because, first of all, let's look at the broader historical events that led to it. First of all, the post-Soviet civil war that began in 1991 in Azerbaijan and Armenia and the three Baltic states has never ended. It didn't end, unfortunately, because that's what happens when enormous multinational states fall apart. It's always tragic and it happens through violence. So I think this is, on one level, the latest episode of the implosion of the Soviet Union. Why? First of all, new states emerged, the Russian Federation and the Ukrainian state, which existed on historical borders that were new and thus artificial. All historical borders are artificial before they can sustain themselves over time and through historical memory and historical time become normalized, if you will, in some kind of a national mythology and actual cultural, national thickness of presence. So the modern Ukrainian state is essentially a completely new artificial historical formation within its present borders before the war. And so is the Russian Federation. So to argue that Ukraine has the right to exist simply because the Ukrainian Communist Party chief declared independence in 1991 or the Russian president did so, the Russian Republic, and became... Yes, these are historical facts, but others can say these are completely illegitimate creations whose existence has not really solidified along the historically meaningful lines of nationality, ethnicity, culture, and historical memory. So to argue that, so that's one point of contention. This is one source of trouble, tension, that has not been resolved since 1991 between Russia and Ukraine. The second element is these are multinational societies. There's huge part of Ukrainian society that is ethnically Russian, self-identified, right? I mean, this is another point of contention. And nobody asked those. They're not even ethnic minorities. These are constitutive parts that are arguably even a majority of Ukrainians identify with Russian speaking or did up to a certain point between 1991 and 2022. Then the next question becomes, how do these two countries coexisted since the downfall of their common Soviet political entity, right? Because many Ukrainians identify to this day as Soviets, and many Russians do. Many do not, right? So what was at the core of the Russian national identity? It's a gray area. The modern Russian state has maintained some trappings of imperial symbology, like its coat of arms, right? The two-headed eagle. But it also uses the Soviet anthem that everybody in the Soviet Union who is older than 20 years of age knows that that's the Soviet anthem. The Russian anthem is the Soviet anthem. It maintains the Red Star identification of its military units.
As well as hammer and sickle.
As well as the hammer and sickle as its combat flag. So what is that about? So I think one of the things that we are still witnessing here is the unsettled Russian national identity, which emerged in 1991. How can you have an imperialist state that doesn't even have a settled national identity? It's impossible. It's a contradiction in the very terms of the word imperialism. Same thing for Ukraine. Ukraine uses the flag, the yellow-blue flag, which was created by the Austro-Hungarian Empire political engineers who created this political project as a way of introducing instability in the then existing Russian Empire in its western reaches. That's the contemporary flag of the Ukraine. Ukraine has had many flags. Nestor Makhno's anarchist forces black flag was also a Ukrainian political flag, which had millions of followers in the Russian Civil War. I don't see that flag anywhere in the Ukraine, publicly proclaimed as part of its identity, to say nothing of the other flags. In its Soviet period, there was a Republic of Ukraine in the Soviet Union. It was a political entity as part of a federative state, just the way Bulgaria is part of a confederation in the European Union. Soviet Socialist Ukrainian Republic was a government, it was a state with a government that was part of a larger transnational entity. How come that's claimed not to exist in modern Ukrainian historiography? That's a little bit strange. So you have unsettled Russian national identity as this new state that's trying to find its bearings into its imperial past, but yet it can't really do that because there's no more aristocratic class in charge. The revolution kind of eliminated that. So you have an unstable national identity, unsettled, which reaches back into its imperial past, but also into its Soviet past, whatever it is convenient for itself, or simply because to many ordinary Russians, if you did the polls, the liberal Levada polling organization, institution, does
Very
these polls,
pro-Western, very
and
pro-Western.
it's very pro-Western. It's directly funded by Western NGOs, i.e., Western governments. But all of the surveys after the 1990s, there's increasing, you can call it Soviet nostalgia or whatever, but that's just a bad word to describe. Many ordinary Russians compared before and now, and they said before is in many ways better. Or at least they seem to be judging the Soviet past in positive terms, if critically so.
Mm-hmm.
So Russia is this kind of unsettled political identity, in my view. Ukraine, too, except since 2008 and definitely since 2014, something happened in Ukraine, which was a dramatic political transformation. What do I mean by that? What I mean by that is the elevation, which was there before, but the elevation of a particular narrative of what does it mean to be Ukrainian, which was always associated in Ukrainian society with Western Ukraine. In the context of recent history since World War II, before World War II and since World War II, and that is neo-Nazi allied nationalist discourse, which is grounded in racism. The formation of a Ukrainian nation as a function of blood and genetics, very common in European politics between World War II. Hitler wasn't the only one, and Mussolini wasn't the only one, but less Mussolini, more Hitler. Biologically grounded, genetically grounded notions of the formation of the new Ukrainian nation becomes something that is more and more enshrined on the level of the state. Now, this can only happen in Ukraine. I know for a fact, this can only happen in Ukraine through massive external financial support, which started before the Soviet Union. The Bandera and related Ukrainian forms of nationalism and state building were always marginal in Ukraine as a whole, always. But now they are hegemonic. This can only happen through the deliberate support of the West. Why? A, because it's the most destructive form of anti-Russian politics imaginable within the Ukraine, because it's explicitly anti-Russian. It's anti-communist, but there are no more communists. So now the accent is shifted towards race. Okay? So the introduction, and we have to say something about what that means about Europe and the question of neo-Nazism, because that's like my main point. I feel.
Yeah, but before you get there, if I may, I'd like to perhaps make another specification here, or maybe another observation, if you like. It's everything you explain is fascinating, by the way. I really think that people should sort of familiarize themselves with that and should kind of break with the newly established tradition that history starts 15 minutes ago. Well, it does start. It's not the case, and like, for as long as the public opinions of, in our region or wherever in the world keep thinking that way, then we cannot have any kind of positive intellectual outcome of such a thinking or understanding or perception of reality. So I think it's very, very important, all those elements that you sort of outlined here. And also I think that this perspective that we are witnessing yet another stage of the tragedy, which began with the dissolution or destruction of the Soviet Union. This is something that the left should be not only aware of, but should be preaching really, as a kind of proper explanation of understanding of certain historical and political processes. And it's totally absent, unfortunately, on the left. But that's another matter. Like the ignorance of the left and its kind of political and intellectual bankruptcies is another show. But what I also want to add here is that, okay, all those things are true, and I totally agree with it. But even if you want to use the kind of vulgar terms, you're still wrong to deem Russia's intervention as imperialist. Now, you might disagree with the argumentation of the Kremlin or of the Russian authorities. You might disagree with people defending partially or entirely their argumentation. You might disagree on many levels, morally, politically, however you like. But you should try and you should try and exercise minimum thinking. And if you do that, you will see that there's no trace of imperialism on the Russian end. Because historically speaking, again, and you have to bring up history, the modern Russian state, okay, consists of basically three elements, and has always consisted of three elements, geographically speaking, which is the Greater Russia, the Lesser Russia, and the White Russia. That's what Russia is historically speaking. And those two last elements that I mentioned, White Russia, which literally means Belarus, and it is the Belarusian territory today, and Lesser Russia, which is pretty much everything that Russia annexed right now, plus Odessa, basically, and the region around there. This is normally, this used to be Russian, and there has been a general consensus all over the world that this is Russia. And there is a historiographic consensus, if you like, among people who understand history, that this has always been, the composition of the modern Russian state. Now, so that's one thing. So those two, so Russia, territorially speaking, even if you want to look at it just physically, by the physical indicators, you will see that Russia has been pushed back territorially as a state, as a power, to borders which are barely acceptable if you take into consideration the history of that state. So they are on the defense, and they have been on the defense pretty much since the events that brought down the Soviet Union occurred. So they have been always on the defense. And within this particular conflict, you said it, like, Ukraine has been has been a proxy that America has never had. Like, this is the most convenient territory, the most convenient entity to use against Russia to finish it off. They began finishing it off in 1990, and then something went wrong from their perspective. And if from 2000, in particular from 2007, and then from 2014, and now with the war, things have like everything has undergone certain shifts, very important ones. And when you look at it that way, when you see how the Ukrainian state from 2004, then 2008, you mentioned that, and then 2014, which was probably the kind of the most spectacular festival of that change, how it was turned into a tool of international politics, or one part of international elite, whatever, NATO, Euro-Atlantic elite, however you want to call it, was turned into a tool to finish off certain unfinished businesses, against Russia. And it's very easy. It's for everyone to see. I mean, there are no secrets. Everyone is talking about it. There are documents, and there are articles written about how every stage of that change, of that major shift, has been prepared and has been fueled and funneled with Western money, Western so-called civic society organizations, NGOs, and stuff like that. That was the case with the Orange Revolution. That was the case with the Maidan events, and that is the case with this war. And what Russia has done, and again, you might agree with it or you might not agree with it. You might be apprehended about it morally or politically. You might have all kinds of ideas about it. What Russia has done with this conflict is it has responded to immediate threats to the existence of its statehood. And this is very easy to prove, because if you locate American or Western or NATO military installations in regions like Kharkov, in regions like Crimea, what you effectively are doing is you're surrounding the Russian state to the extent that it cannot function militarily at any possible level in terms of international politics. And they knew that in Russia, they've known that in Russia, and they've warned they warned time after time about this thing happening and this thing not being received well. And you know, there were protestations after protestations. Some of them even were brought up in this discussion by former American diplomats who think that the American policy is absolutely mad vis-a-vis Russia and with regards to Ukraine. So we see all those things, right? We see all those things. And you know, to call in this context, even again, even if you want to be very vulgar about it, without all the deliberations, you know, theoretical ones, you see that this is not an imperialist conflict. This is a conflict to secure the continuation of the existence of the Russian state.
That's totally true. And we could add also in terms of your comments as to the left, broadly defined, takes these positions, although not everyone, is I think, and I think this is an important point that some of my colleagues who identify on the left, we have these debates with them, they don't seem to understand something, is that military sovereignty is the condition for political sovereignty. This is all historians of imperialism, whether they were imperialists or not, understood. This is what Lenin understood. This is what all students of politics who are on any level of seriousness and understand that military sovereignty presupposes political independence. The existence of a country as a sovereign state presupposes military sovereignty. So the ability for your political community to militarily defend itself adequately is the number one requirement after which political independence becomes possible. And this speaks to your point about, and this is exactly the reason why the Soviet Union in Stalin's period after World War II, it had no choice. It had to extend into Eastern Europe as a buffer zone.
Yes.
Because the lack, unfortunately for you, from the point of view of somebody in the Czech Republic who wanted Czechoslovakia to be an independent sovereign state in its entirety, right? To the extent that that's even possible for small states, that's a different question. But the existence of Eastern European buffer zone for the Soviet Union after a war which killed 27 million people of its own population is 100% motivated by the need to have military sovereignty, the ability to militarily defend yourself as a prerequisite for being politically independent. And I think your point is exactly the same with Russia as well. People may not like that. People may call that an instrumental thinking or justification. No, that's empirical politics 101. And I think on the left, and I hate the term left because it has become completely meaningless and I just don't even use it anymore.
Thank you. Yes.
You could be a leftist who is an imperialist, which is exactly the majority of the cases.
Yeah, the majority of the Eastern European left, by the way, unfortunately.
Yeah. So
yes, they are so pro-war.
Yeah. So to not understand that basic point is that because the left doesn't study military history, or the military
disgusted at it.
Yes, or the military component of political life. It's the most important factor. I mean, this is like basic politics. This is Machiavelli. This is Plato, Aristotle. This is the entire, if you will, Enlightenment tradition. Gramsci, this is Kant, this is the nation of the basis of sovereignty is Marx in the class struggle, which ultimately expressed on the level of the state presupposes the use of force, and military is the predominant location of decisive force. So anyways, until 2014, there's no conflicts that hint of war between Ukraine and Russia. It's unimaginable. It's unimaginable. So what changes in 2014? What changes is the direct replacement of a Ukrainian government, as oligarchic as it was, as ineffective, as criminal, as capitalist comprador as it was, all true, but it's replaced by a direct proxy regime of NATO. I say NATO, but I mean the United States because that's the overwhelming political force in control of it. The Europeans are irrelevant. The French military is irrelevant. The Ukrainian military is far more powerful than any European militaries. minus the Russian. So in 2014, what happens is, from the Russian point of view, and for any student of history, like you said, it's very obvious that the introduction of NATO bases, even theoretically, completely removes Russian military sovereignty in that area, because the introduction of NATO long-range missiles in eastern Ukraine with nuclear missiles, with nuclear warheads, would automatically invalidate, or it will reduce the reaction time of Russian political leadership in the cases of an attack to seconds, less than a minute, not enough, and thus it'll destroy strategic deterrence. Now, somebody might say that's an assumption. You're assuming that NATO would place nuclear arms in Kharkov. Well, is there any juridical document that was signed that said explicitly that it would not? The answer is no.
Yes.
In the absence of explicit documents, they say we will not place nuclear weapons in Ukraine. Anything is possible, and thus the risk is too great not to be taken. That is the easiest way to create a war if you wanted to. And that was
they did it. And they did it. Yeah.
No, I just want
also,
to just a second.
Sure,
I
please,
want
please.
to say something here, which is, I think, very important, because, as you said, apparently on the left there is very little knowledge on what the CIA did, what the secret services did, and unfortunately, we don't talk enough about the secret services. I mean, you may say that I'm a little bit obsessed with this, especially since I come from a country where the secret services held enormous power and still do. And unfortunately, here in Romania, we didn't witness during the socialist time the dictatorship of the proletariat, but we witnessed unregulated and unhinged secret services. It was the dictatorship of the secret services. And maybe I am a little bit prone and emphasizing their power, but I'm very disappointed to see that on the left there is little interest. And maybe I am interested because I had direct, interaction with the power of the state, of the security apparatus manifested through the secret services. But I want to emphasize the importance of reading. If you don't want to believe us, if you think that we are conspiracy theorists, crazy leftists, derailed individuals, go to Lindsay O'Rourke. She's no leftist. She is an established academic coming from the West, and she has an excellent chapter on what the CIA did after World War II in Ukraine and how much money they pumped into the right wing and extremists that fought alongside with the Nazis during World War II just to fight the Soviet Union. She, as I told you, she's not a leftist. She's not aligned with any kind of progressive thinking, but she is an honest historian that has a lot of details related to that. I had a short comment during our podcast on her book, which I found very important. And I find it important also because, so to speak, she's not on our side. So if you don't believe anything, you listened here, just listen maybe to these so-called neutral voices that still are able to write interesting books in the United States. And I think also for the leftists who think that we are somehow, I don't know, too pro-Russia or too influenced by this, they should look into how much money the United States and the West invested in Ukraine since not 2014, but 1945, after Second World War II, since they invested there, and how much support was given to people that had a horrendous past in terms of fighting along with the Nazis and being engaged in the killings of thousands, if not dozens of thousands of Poles, Jews, and yeah, you might look into that. That was my observation here, and also imperialist. I think we should also go against this very simplistic definition, Boyan, because you know why most people believe that Russia is waging an imperial war? Because we have a very simplistic definition. Big country attacks small country, therefore big country imperialist power, right? So let us define a little bit imperialism again so that we understand why is it that it is not enough to have the big fish attacking the small fish to call the big fish imperialists.
Yeah. Okay. That's a very good point, I think. But I want to stress here, replying to your question, or kind of commenting on the point that you made, is that there are a few definitions basically of imperialism, throughout the kind of, well, the kind of political literature spectrum, okay, which tackles imperialism in general. Like, of course, the tradition that I belong to, which is pretty much what Lenin defined, or the way Lenin described it or defined imperialism. And I think this is also something that Arto mentioned in the beginning, is that imperialism cannot function without the leverage of exploitation. I mean, imperialism is, at its core, does is an economic construct, right? That's why it derives basically from the moment when the European superpowers reached out to the rest of the world to establish their colonies, because they required colonial influx, or influx of the, of the colonized territories, like in terms of slave labor, in terms of like raw materials, in terms of all kinds of other things that they extracted from those colonies in order to sustain and develop the system that they were in. So that's at the very bottom of the whole thing. Now, on top of that, of course, there are many other nuances which we could speak about for hours here. But this is how things are. I mean, imperialist war is a war which is directed, okay, which is directed at acquiring, I don't know, land, or acquiring economy, or acquiring notions that will help you sustain and develop the system that you're in, at the expense of whatever party you're being imperialist towards, like, or whatever party you're colonizing, and so on and so forth, right? So this is something which is completely different to what is happening right now in Ukraine. Now, look, I really don't want to come across as someone who defends Putin or defends Russia or defends wars or stuff like that. I want us to be to stick to the facts when we analyze things. Russia did not have any interest, imperialist or any other, in waging a war of aggression, especially when it is unprepared. Logical? I guess logical to everyone. Now, Russia had much more interest in maintaining the kind of thin peace between Eastern and Western Ukraine that had existed, since the emergence of the new Ukrainian state after the fall apart of the Soviet Union, than to invade, destroy, and then have to rebuild and do all those costly things that they are in right now. So, when you come to think about this in a logical, fact based manner, you will see that there's not a trace of imperialism here. I mean, this is something which I don't want to say it's the opposite of imperialism, but it's something which is very a far cry from the notion of imperialism, however you want to define it, unless, of course, you use the most vulgar kind of empirical moral definition that there's big country and small country and so on and so forth. So this is, if we take this out of the like this kind of understanding out of the equation, we will see that there's a whole range of facts that we can analyze, we can put in front of ourselves, and we can see that it's just like, as much as we might hate the war, as much as we might even hate Russia, which is a very popular emotion in Europe, by the way, as much as we can dislike, as much as we could be pacifist, for example, or something like that. It is a war, and we might criticize it, but it's not an imperialist war. It's a different war, and I think
you can say it's a self-defense war.
I think, yeah, personally, I agree with the idea that it is a self-defense war. I really do agree with that. And I have to say, I've had a change of mind with regards to that. Perhaps it's a kind of confession to make that. In the beginning, after 24th of February, I was really I was puzzled and perplexed and shocked, and I had all those kind of misunderstandings in my head about how to approach it, and I was very much against it. But with the time passing, with the arguments being laid forward, with the multitude of articles that I read on both sides, like American corporate media, Russian media, with listening to thousands of podcasts, and speaking with many knowledgeable people about that, most notably on those that were on our program, I kind of I've had a change of mind, a gradual change of mind. You know, I'm just asking myself the very simple question: what were the Russians supposed to do? That's like, what were they supposed to? Where were they gonna go? Like, this is either they would capitulate totally to the West and would allow the West to split them into five different republics or something like that, and that would be effectively the end of the history of the Russian state, or they would defend themselves in the manner that they can do that. And we've established that many times with our former guests here. I mean, with other guests on our show, that the Russians are not in the business of regime change operations, colored revolutions, and that kind of stuff. They don't want to do anything and until they are pressed and they have to do something, and then they do what they've done in Ukraine. And I think this is something that is absolutely tragic, and I'm heartbroken to see that war: Russians fighting Russians or Ukrainians fighting Ukraine. All those things. This is terrible, but this is not the product of Russian imperialism. If there is imperialism involved, and I believe there is, then it's the product of the American imperialism, who managed to take over the political process, to manage to put themselves in charge of the internal political process in Ukraine. And that's my view today.
No,
Yes, yes, I'm very curious about what Arto has to say
Well-
about this imperialism and this
Well-
very, very simplistic definition: big country attacks small country, big country imperialist.
Well, because I mean, yes, I think this is the central question, and maybe we can also say also about Maria's point about secret services and but before, with the imperialism, I feel that the word imperialism only makes sense if we associate it with current imperialism. What does imperialism mean today? I think we can begin to understand, and if we ask ourselves, what is capitalism today? Where is this ground? Where is the core, the heart of the capitalist global system today? In other words, where are its most powerful parts, and what are the rules through which it works? So the core of the capitalist economy, we understand, we know empirically as well, is United States, European Union, Japan with satellite areas like South Korea, China, but China has its interesting case because in China, there is no capitalist class that exerts ultimate political power. That's what a lot of people don't understand too, especially on the left. They say China is a capitalist state. China cannot be a capitalist state if the capitalist class, as the private holders of socially created wealth, have ultimate political control. In China, the Chinese Communist Party has this enormous bureaucratic machine, has ultimate political control. It includes capitalists, but they're a tiny minority. By definition, this cannot be a capitalist state. Otherwise, it's meaningless to use these words. The same thing with the Soviet Union, by the way. I just want to say that a lot of leftists have trouble with the Soviet Union and embracing its overall historical role as an anti-colonial and anti-fascist, anti-imperialist force, having defeated the most powerful imperialist force until now, called the United Europe, united under Nazi Germany, right? That was the premier imperialist force of the mid-20th century. But the Soviet Union did not have a capitalist class that existed, A, period, or two, that was in power through its own capitalist class political priorities. I think it's very simple to understand that, but it's almost impossible to encounter people, it seems like, who in my academic life who agree with me, except for certain exceptions. But that's their problem. The interesting point here is that, so what is the capitalist? We're talking about the core of the capitalist economy today, the United States, the European Union. If you combine these two economies, That's the vast majority of wealth produced in the world, minus China and Japan. This is the biggest military apparatus in the world. So more military force is concentrated in the alliance called, so-called alliance, European Union, US, NATO. NATO is the world's most powerful military alliance. Okay, so that's fact number two. Fact number one, the center of the global capitalist economy is concentrated in the country members of NATO, basically West European Union and United States. What are the political and economic priorities of the political classes, the capitalist classes that dominate NATO, the countries members of NATO? I'm discounting the small ones because they don't matter, but the big ones, right? The United States, Germany, France, United Kingdom. Global domination in the sense of global economic domination. So large American corporations are locked in the quest to ever find new markets or to ever develop leadership in global markets. Okay, Apple sells in China, McDonald's is available everywhere, Ford wants to sell cars everywhere in the world. So the internal logic of the capitalist system today, just like yesterday, was monopolization of the global markets under the control of this international financial elite, except it's not so international because it's culturally Anglo-Saxon, dominated by Anglo-Saxons, UK/American, and their allies among the large capitalist economies of Germany and Italy and so on and so forth. So yes, there's an economic logic that seeks monopolization of the global markets for the purposes of profit creation in many different ways. Virtual profits through sale of making money through social networks or actual physical objects, doesn't matter. But what is the cultural, historical form of this global elite? Most powerful part of the global capitalist. It's US, UK based. That's empirical fact. Because of World War II, all of the international capitalist economic banks of coordination are US dominated. Bank of International Settlement, even though formally it's based in Switzerland, it doesn't matter. Its foundational documents and ideas were written by US strategists taking advantage of their victory in World War II. These are American-controlled institutions. The World Bank, it's headquartered in the United States. The Bank of International Development. The UN is based in the United States.
That's right.
So most of the weapons in the world are created by US weapons manufacturers using US patents. They have the legal right to use them. The Swedish Gripen fighter jet that Bulgaria was trying to purchase uses a US engine and US electronics, which means it cannot exist without US blessing, right? So then the question becomes, okay, so who are the political opponents of this global, most powerful part of the global capitalist world, which is imperialist because it aims to dominate the financial, economic, and political structures of the world, right? It aims to have influence. Well, the primary enemies are China, but in order to get to China, you have to go through the Russian landmass.
That's
Russia
right.
has the premier military land force of the world, and China has the premier economy in the world. It's overtaking the United States. So if you look at it in this sense, then weird decisions make sense. For example, why is it that the new Ukrainian country that is trying to build its national identity, of course it's going to define itself anti-Soviet. Okay, we got that. But why is it anti-Soviet in a way that's pro-Nazi in its symbology? That's I don't understand. You can be anti-Soviet as an American or as an English person because you're not a communist, but you sympathize with the Soviet Union's anti-fascist, anti-Nazi struggle in World War II, especially since you were allies to that country. Why is it that in the Ukraine we witnessed the resuscitation and the activation of a marginal part of Ukrainian society, meaning neo-Nazism? Why are Soviet Ukrainian World War II memorials being destroyed by the government of Ukraine? Why is it that Ukrainian Soviet generals or war heroes whose monuments are being removed from their own land in a society where 300,000 people, according to official Ukrainian studies of the war post-Soviet Union, 300,000 people were members of the Bandera and the UPA and UNA neo-Nazi collaborator forces. 3 million Ukrainians fought in the Soviet army against them. It's a 1-to-10 ratio in the official Ukrainian historiography. Why is it that 8 million Ukrainians died in World War II through the direct invasion of the United European armies under Nazi control? Right? Yet their memorials commemorating their sacrifices and the loss of life are being actively dismantled. To me, there can be only one explanation: the activation of neo-Nazism as an ideology, as a tool in this war against, which aims the dismantling of the Russian Federation as a political subject. That's the only explanation, because there are no more anti-Russian enemies than biological racists who identify with the program introduced by the Nazi Party. Meaning, but what is the party? What is Nazi politics really about? Because we tend to caricature the Nazi period in Europe through the concentration camps because that's too obvious to ignore. You can't say the genocide didn't happen because the evidence is still there, the history. But the Nazis had a different project. The Nazis' project was unified Europe on a new socio-cultural basis. So the Nazi project of united Europe, so the Nazi military project was defeated. The Nazi racist project was defeated or temporarily put on hold, if you will. But the Nazi economic restructuring and political restructuring of Europe lived in the European Union. And this is not a mystery. It's only a mystery because we haven't studied it, because we don't know about it. But one of the interesting books that was published in English and in many other languages was released in, I have the citation here, in 1972 in East Germany, in East Berlin. And this was a volume of documents which followed a series of conferences. And the book is called The Anatomy of Aggression, New Documents Concerning the Military Goals of German Imperialism During World War II. And this is an assembly of primary source strategic planning documents by the Nazi government, which basically aimed to create a newly integrated Europe with a different character than existed before, under, obviously, German leadership. And in order for that to happen, again, the Soviet Union had to be eliminated, or Russia in contemporary words, because Russia is the successor of the Soviet Union, given its weight in terms of population, economic need, and so on and so forth. So what happened was, and there's an interesting book published in French and soon to be available in English in 2023 called Free to Obey, How the Nazis Invented Modern Management by Johann Chapoupot, a French historian, a well-known young French historian, who basically shows how the entire, what we call neoliberal technique of managing the capitalist economy was in many ways in Europe, in America, slightly different style, but in Europe, this was the creation of SS, highly educated SS legal scholars who became the dominant business school professors of post-World War II Western Europe. In other words, according to Chapoupot's book, the entire ideological orientation of how to think about the economy, which now we associate with the European Union, neoliberalism or ordo-liberal, small government, specific management techniques that produce optimal corporate and good governance, these very words like good citizenship, these are rooted in SS, as the elite of Nazi Germany's planning body, attempts on how we're going to rule the new united Europe, which includes Ukraine and Western Russia, by the way. How are we going to rule over a large and very diverse terrain of different people and nationalities and ethnicities who vastly outnumber us, with minimal use of our highly qualified and competent German civil servants? It's a problem of efficiency, just the way the British did in India. Mm-hmm. And the solution was what we call today neoliberalism. In other words, the book is extraordinary. I mean, I hope to read the full version once the English translation comes up, but it goes through primary source documents and how those ideas got transformed into united Europe, good governance in the UN, and etc. It requires transnational structures. It requires the erasure of borders and cultural and ethnic distinctions. It requires the erasure of history and its very quick rewriting along lines that are bureaucratic, ahistorical. I mean, a lot of things that we witness in the European Union's education reforms and et cetera. So I personally am convinced in these historians' work who, and I may sound crazy by declaring that the danger of the current war is the reactivation of a new form of Nazism, which I would like to define initially because we don't know its full contours yet, because they haven't won the war yet. Because if they win in the Ukraine versus Russia civil war, it can be immediately extended across Europe. I think this new emerging form of neo-Nazism, which we're witnessing in the Ukraine as the proving ground, if you will, is a form of imperialism, right? With associated forms of economic structures, okay? How to govern vast territories, the European continent, in ways that cut across national, historical, and cultural lines, but are grounded, because there's nothing else to do, in a form of racism. New racism, i.e., the formation of a new ethnicity, but not the Soviet new person that we studied in the that existed in the 1920s and 1930s, but a new type of a racist new people who could be defined along the familiar lines of the new racial new man. And in the Ukraine, by the way, I noticed this in the military. Ukrainian military units are now wearing the early World War II Eastern Front Nazi insignia on their tanks, the White Cross. This is a new transformation in the Ukrainian military signing. There's a more explicit introduction of neo-Nazi symbology, even on the level of the military, openly.
Who do you think in this new attempt to reform and represent and kind of reestablish as a standard thing the kind of this extremist ideology, Nazism, neo-Nazism, like do you see the kind of the Übermensch and the Untermensch thing? Like, do you see this emerging too? Because
Yeah,
of course racism is there, but obviously, now they're going to be smarter this time around because they've learned their lesson that they perhaps in the 40s they shouldn't have perhaps tried and exterminate half of Europe like the Slavs and stuff. Now they kind of incorporated them, right? And they
yeah.
go against, right? So I wonder, do you see this classical thing emerging as well? Like,
In a new way. And
mhm,
the Untermensch are anybody who's Russian speaking today. Tomorrow it could be something else.
yeah,
But today it's the anybody who is Russian speaking is the Untermensch, and you see this in public pronouncements of European officials.
mhm,
You see even the language of um, in the primitive propaganda level when they talk about the war, they say Putin.
mhm.
They personalize an entire government to a person,
Entire nation.
a nation. And when they refer to the Ukrainians, or they say the Ukrainian people, or they refer to the Germans or the whatever. So it's these very primitive tactics are reactivated with this primitive fictionalized narrative of cultural differences that the Russian speakers or the Russians are not Europeans. They were never Europeans. They were Asiatic. They were primitive. When in fact, European intellectual and cultural history. I mean, I'm no fan of the Russian Empire as a fan of the Soviet experiment, as you know. But in the last 400 years, can you think of any more fundamental constitutive forces of post-Enlightenment Europe than the presence of Russia? Culturally, politically, with the Napoleonic Wars, and then all of I mean, from the point of view of the great imperial politics, nonetheless, but in terms of the formation of post-European Enlightenment Europe, is it possible to imagine the label Europe without Russian
Mm,
civilization? It's impossible. All of us form Europe. Some of us, in the smaller societies like Bulgaria, or in the larger societies like Poland or Russia, but we're all constitutive of Europe in all of its, complexity and richness. How can you eliminate Russia from that? But that was the Nazi move explicitly activated by Hitler. Whether he believed it or not is a different story, but the Nazis used it, that Russia, the Russians and the Soviets are not Europeans. This is a Nazi argument.
Yeah.
Churchill believed it. And now all of a sudden, European Union, who is the foreign minister of Europe? That pathetic excuse for
Josep Borrell.
yeah, who said it explicitly? The Russians must be exterminated. They must be defeated. Like,
Mm.
who are you to make these judgments based on what historical,
No, but
cultural?
let's
Yeah,
leave that guy out
yeah,
of the equation, because
yeah.
he's clearly not stable enough
It's
to
not
make any
important.
kind of, yeah, like in a sense that this is a psychiatric case.
Yeah.
But and we're not specialized in this. So, but for the end of this discussion, which I find absolutely fascinating, I want to direct a question to you, Maria, because we've just had an hour or over an hour of of a magnificent discussion with great points being made, most of them or
I
all of
agree.
them contrary, to the narrative that is so overwhelmingly present right now. And and certain books and certain works were brought up, and certain historical moments, and you know everything we discussed here was very important. But this is something that I believe, without being an academic, and both of you are, okay, I don't even have a university degree, not that I want to boast about it, but just to make sure that there's this
It doesn't.
distinction is
Yeah.
understood, is like what those discussions, like the one that we just had, they should be part of the active academic life, like all across the region here, or all across the world maybe, but particularly all across the region, because we are being turned into the subject of history now, as it happened in the past, and we know what how those processes ended in the past. Like, the World War II basically eradicated the Polish state, which had to be rebuilt from scratch. Okay, not only the capital, which was totally bombed down to but all of it, right? I mean, we're talking about mass casualties. I mean, we're talking about
Yes.
tens of millions of people dead, and enormous, like absolutely hair-raising, horrific, events like Hiroshima, Nagasaki, or the bombing of Dresden, and that kind of stuff, right? So we should be actively interested, especially this layer of society which has the pretense, which kind of puts forward the claim that we are the intellectual kind of class here. We have the superiority in that field, or in that, or whatever field, that we've learned so much, we've studied, we've got the PhDs and all the rest of it. Where are you guys? Why aren't you discussing it? What are you doing? Like, this is my question to you, Marie. What are your colleagues doing?
Well, unfortunately, in the case of Romania, especially the students and teachers in international relations, security studies, and even history, are exposed to only one side of the information. And even the faculty and the Department of Political Science in the University of Bucharest is so pro-NATO.
But they are
So,
researchers. They
and
should be able to reach beyond that.
let me explain. And I think this is very dangerous. Why? Because as Stanislav Bishok, another academic from Moscow, said, you cannot be an expert and pro-NATO at the same time. You have to be an expert, period, and you have to be able to formulate critical points of view, even though they contradict some of your intuitions or some of the, I don't know, political parties, leaders that you may like. This is the very definition of intellectuals. And to me, the main problem, I discussed this with a very very interesting and well documented intellectual, Andrei Mocharov, who taught for 40 years in the Academy of Economic Sciences here in Bucharest. And he said that, and I made this point a lot of times during our show, there is a cognitive war, and unfortunately the West won that. uh, what do I mean by that? People are so convinced. I told you they are self colonized. They don't need
Okay.
the United States to come and tell them that they have to obey. They obey by being true believers. They truly believe the
So
propaganda.
it's a church.
And
NATO is
the
also a
church,
church, not just.
unfortunately. And unfortunately, the Russians and no one, the Russians may challenge this power militarily. China may challenge this empire economically, but so far, no one is able to challenge the huge, powerful Western propaganda. No one.
So,
There
a
is no
supplementary
Yeah.
question, a
power
supplementary question, if you allow, because this is
with.
very, very important here. So, you're telling me that when I go onto, let's say, Facebook or Twitter or some other anti-social, as I like to call them, network, I go there and I see a leftist academic with like 2 PhDs, someone that I know, by the way, but I'm not going to throw names here, writing complete, utter, crappy nonsense, repeating, things that were just posted on the New York Times or Washington Post's page, about
Or
crazy
on the
regime in Russia.
Department
Yeah,
of Defense in the
yeah,
United
but I
States.
want to ask, does this mean that this person does not deserve their PhDs? Does it mean that they have proven that they've made no effort in terms of thinking, that they have
No,
proven
it
by that,
proves,
but that they
Boyan,
have
that
not
people.
reached out beyond the most superficial, thick as it might be, but superficial kind of, propaganda mud?
Well, unfortunately, people are not bad, as I told you, often because they are
No, it's not a
somehow
moral judgment,
inherently bad, but
intellectual.
they have been exposed in the academia and our current academic system to only one side of the question. And they've been exposed only to books, authors, teachers that tell basically pretty much the same story: Russia bad, West and collective West good. There is, I think, I don't know how many teachers also have the guts to go against this
I'm
current
thinking this is
narrative.
perhaps, yeah.
And you remember Professor Wolf telling you that he went to Yale, he went to Harvard, he went to the most prestigious academic institutions in the United States, and he had only one teacher that dared to give him at that time some Marxist literature to study. It was almost impossible to reach it. And when you are immersed into this bubble, and exposed only to discourses that pretty much tell you the same thing, it's very difficult to step out. Believe me, I was there. I was 100% convinced that the free market economy is the best tool, and the capitalist system is the best system that was ever invented. And it was so difficult to step out of the narrative, very difficult. Maybe my background and the fact that I work, I do manual labor, I encounter workers, and I'm pretty much connected to their reality, made me realize once they forced me to write articles for free, saying that I am giving those articles to the Western academic journals and I win prestige. And I said, I don't eat prestige, I need money. I don't need your prestige. And that was the click, but I was so immersed into this. And they also have a very powerful tools to efficiently silence you, because they don't kill you like the communists did. They were brutal and stupid here in Romania. No, they destroy you psychologically. They make you look like a fringe crazy person that no one should listen to. They let you live, but they humiliate you if they want. And they exclude you and they cancel you from the academic life. So it's very dangerous. I'm I told you many times that I'm quite afraid, because I think I'm not important enough and not enough people listen to me. But once I become an important voice and a popular voice, oh, you'll see some canceling and you'll see some brutal attacks coming my way.
This
Yeah,
is so
please weigh
important.
in.
Just to follow on Maria's point, I think, a long time ago, I think it was in the early 60s, the French intellectual philosopher, Louis Althusser, said that the university and thus the intellectuals working in them are the ideological part of the ideological state apparatus. So there should be no expectations for some
So I'm
kind
being
of
naive, basically. That's
no. We should have no expectations or very low expectations of any kind of thinking let's say about politics, to come from the typical kind of well-established professors in the university, of which he was one, of course, but he lived in a transitionary period. So I think what happened in the last 40 years, 50 years is that people who study politics or people who study history became academics working in universities instead of organic intellectuals who may have been members of a political party or a political organization. Like, so for example, when Pasolini, the great Italian poet, filmmaker, who was an intellectual, he was not a college professor, right? He was a filmmaker and a poet and a journalist, but he was an intellectual, right? So his social function, because he was associated to a political organization, and he was not part of the organization that's literally an extension of the state, allowed him to think, right, through contradictions and etc. Whereas the moment you become a member of the university, unless you really want to be marginalized, like Maria said, or like I'm super marginal figure, which is great because it allows me to say what I want to say, But the moment you become a successful professor in that sense, you essentially become a member of this kind of hegemonic part of the elite,
establishment, basically.
of the establishment, and universities are totally integrated into the establishment, whether they're part of the state or whether they're private. So I think the way out is to recapture this tradition where people who work through ideas and study ideas and try to make sense of them are outside of the university, are part of political organizations that exist outside of the university and are politically independent, even if they're marginal, because there's no other way, I think, and yes, becoming a professor, unless you're careful, will, I think, definitely integrate you into the establishment, and you will not be exposed to the layers of history that are the truth.
Yeah, unless I suppose you're a figure which is so strong that it can overwhelm certain pressures, like, I don't know, Sachs or whom I mentioned, or maybe this or Richard Wolff. Like, he's also, he's like, obviously,
Right.
as you said in the previous segment, the American establishment is able to tolerate certain figures like that.
But
right?
even Sachs is not advocating the transcendence of capitalism.
No, of course not. What I'm trying to say is that he
This way
goes
he's
against the
allowed
narrative.
to. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But he goes against the narrative to the extent that many people admire, right? Like, whether it's correct reaction or not, we could discuss that. But what I'm trying to say is that he's able to do that because he's so powerful by his own record that he can, push back on certain things, or
and most of the American power elite, or the political elite, or the oligarchs, what is an oligarch? A politically engaged and politically sophisticated capitalist who pays attention to politics, not just the accumulation of their own wealth. So the American capitalist class, or at least the politically active part of it that kind of exerts political power on the government, they have their own research institutes. I mean, the Council on Foreign Relations is a well-studied one. They have their own seminars constantly studying politics outside of the formal academic university structures. I mean, they use professors, they hire professors to lecture them for 3 months on Ukraine or whatever. So I think for people like us, the real problem is, like, there is no political party in Bulgaria that I can, like, attach myself to and somehow contribute as a whatever use they might have of me as a tutor or as a whatever within their political organization, maybe to teach history to the political members of the political organization, right? So in the absence of that, it's like...
Yes, it's very difficult, but I think the Barricade, at least for me, this is a personal confession, offers some space of breathing,
Absolutely.
where I can breathe and I can discuss things freely, and I can provide critical analysis, and I can make use of the things that I'm reading, and I hope the viewers find it interesting and interesting enough to support us, because it's very difficult
because it's just two of us, like, we're just two guys, right?
Yeah, exactly.
It's remarkable, actually, what you've done.
Thank you so much. I think this is a good time to end here on
Right.
a more positive note, and to ask our viewers, to the extent that they liked it, to go to our Patreon page, you make a donation, patreon.com/the barricade. Please support us. Now, I saw some of the comments that were mean, saying, oh, just another podcast asking for money. Well, this is it, comrades. I mean, unfortunately, we have to live. We can live on prestige like the
Mm.
Romanian academia asks for me. So we have to rely on you. If you support us, then we can provide more of this. So thanks so much. Thank Arto, thanks Boyan,
Thank you.
and stay healthy, keep fighting. Subscribe to our channel, support us, and we'll see you all in our next edition.
Right. Thank you.